see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world. Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
Hi, I'm Ruth Richards. I'm with the Ahimsa Advisory Board, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Mitch, wherever he went, Mitch Hall, who is a wellness counselor for youth and children, who's a humanitarian, a peace activist, who's a spiritual being, who is truly looking for a greater good in the world. He is a former college academic dean, among other things. He is a published author and scholar, and a very prolific and natural writer. We expect to hear much more from, including a book on this. He is a yoga teacher in the Naroga tradition, and he's someone I've known for some years, to my great pleasure. I invited Mitch to speak on empathy for a symposium at the American Psychological Association, where he was spellbinding, and we almost kept the room too long. He and I both spoke on empathy, peace, and spirituality at a day-long Ahimsa event a few years ago, which was really wonderful. And I can also tell you carefully, without getting into any trouble, that a major professor I know says that Mitch, as a graduate student, was one of the very best students he had ever seen. Yay! And so as the speaker tonight, Mitch brings something I wish we had more of, an excellent and moving combination of, scholarly expertise and a really intuitive, experiential understanding and wisdom about his topic. And we need both. He lives what he presents. Mitch Hall really cares tremendously, as you'll see. And it's an honor and a privilege to introduce Mitch Hall.
Wow, thanks so much, Ruth, and thank you all for coming out on this, for Berkeley, chilly kind of wintry evening. I think some people found blankets, cushions. There are a few cushions over there. There are blankets in the meditation hall. We're not busy. If you ever, need to just stretch an arm or something, as long as it doesn't disrupt the program, feel free. If you can, raise your hand if you can hear me well now. Can you? Okay. If you can't, just sort of do something like that if I start getting very quiet. Okay, so the title is Roots of Empathy in Nonviolence in Childhood. This is a topic that kind of started perplexing me already when I was a child, because in my childhood I had experiences of warmth, support, and nurturance, but also of abuse, but not too much abuse, so I was able to recover and everything. And it set me on a quest from some of the traumas that I experienced. Why are some people in the world so warm and nurturing and supportive, and others so cruel and violent? So in talking about the roots of empathy and nonviolence in childhood, I'll be citing a lot of research. I hope I'll hold your interest. And in order to bring the theme out even better, I'll be citing some of the research about roots of violence in childhood, so that we'll just see the contrast. I'll be presenting a lot of evidence, and then I'll be going a bit, if time allows, into what's called attachment theory and research. How many here feel you're very conversant with attachment theory and research?
Very conversant?
A little conversant? Okay. So we'll see how far we get. So with no further ado, I want to start with an inspirational quotation from Mohandas K. Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi. He says, if we are to reach real peace in the world, in this world, and if we are to carry on a real war against war, we shall have to begin with children. And if they will grow up in their natural innocence, we won't have to struggle, we won't have to pass fruitless, idle resolutions, but we shall go from love to love and peace to peace until at last all corners of the world are covered with that peace and love for which consciously or unconsciously the whole world is striving. Gandhi said that in 1931. What evidence is there that might support Gandhi's perspective on this? And I'd like for a second to call attention to the words, if they will grow up in their natural innocence. One of the things I'll be showing is right from the beginning of life, in the womb, in infancy, influences on children may or may not support that natural innocence. What are those influences for good or ill, and what does it have to do with all the violence, misery, suffering in the world today? Let's move on to some definitions. What is empathy? I have two somewhat different definitions up there. Born for Love, the roots of, Why Empathy is Essential and Endangered, Bruce D. Perry and Maya Salovitz wrote, if the essence of empathy is the ability to stand in other's shoes, to feel what it's like there, and to care about making it better if it hurts. So this is a definition of empathy that includes compassion, caring, to feel for others in a caring way. This is not to be taken for granted. Not all people are equal in the capacity for empathy. I'm working in a field right now, and some of my colleagues are here. Empathy is part of the essential qualities that we need to bring to each of our clients who are in counseling, in therapy, so that they can so we can feel what it's like there, and we care about making it better because they hurt, otherwise they wouldn't be in therapy. The psychologist Louis Cozzolino said that empathy is actually a hypothesis we make about another person based on a combination of visceral, emotional, and cognitive information, an attempt to experiencing the inner life of another while retaining objectivity. So by saying it's a hypothesis, he's using a scientific term. What he means is we need to check it out. We can't take for granted that what we are reading on someone's face and their tone of voice and the look of their eyes and their words is accurate. We need to do a reality check. And they themselves might not even know. In the therapy field, we might have a client who's angry and is not allowed to express anger, or who's scared and has to be macho and can't say, hey, I'm scared. And so empathy, it's a delicate dance and an art, and we have to do a lot of reality checking. And depending on how we were raised from the beginning of our lives, we have greater or lesser skills in empathy. And while he says retaining objectivity, what he means there is we need to be able to know where do I end and where does the other begin? What are my issues? What are the other's issues? That's the objectivity, to be aware of our own inner reality and the others. Enough defining of empathy. How about nonviolence or other term? I like to define terms, at least it gives us something to argue about. Nonviolence, or ahimsa, the name of the organization sponsoring this is ahimsa. It means nonviolence. It's one of the 5 primary ethical principles of the Raja Yoga tradition. It's one of the Maharachas, or great vows of the Jain tradition, which is founded upon nonviolence. So Michael Nagler, a local scholar, said nonviolence is the absence of the desire or intention to harm. That's one level of definition. However, I believe that there are circumstances and structures in the world where violence is being done even though there may not be in the minds of the people the desire or intention to harm. And some people have addressed this, such as Gandhi himself, whose quote we started with, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, because nonviolence as a concept also refers to principled action using nonviolent means to create nonviolent social, economic, political, and cultural values and structures. The nonviolent peace movement, the nonviolent human rights movement, civil rights, social justice. And this has been developed at great length, because not only do we have direct violence of one person intending to harm another and carrying out that harm, but also have what scholars call structural violence, the harmful inequalities of wealth, power, and privilege, the historical realities of the oppression of some groups of people by others. And just to give you a shocking statistic, and this is back from '96, and it was based on UN statistics, while direct violence kills 105 million people per year, and that's actually current according to the World Health Organization, structural violence kills 18 million per year due to lack of adequate housing, medical care, food, sanitary water, and so on. We have a world in which the super rich are getting richer and richer, whether in this country or worldwide. The poor are getting more and more poor, and the middle class are getting harder and harder put upon to make ends meet. So I just want you to bear in mind as we go through this that not only is there direct violence, which most of us think about, there's also structural violence. And if we are committed to nonviolence, the absence of desire, attention to harm, we need to be aware of the violence that's being done, sometimes inadvertently, but the great human costs of the inequalities of the world. Okay, so empathy and nonviolence, when highly developed, motivate compassionate action for personal, interpersonal, and societal healing and protection. Those are the frame of reference that I'm using for this. What is the evidence in support of Gandhi's statement that if we begin with the children, we won't have to pass, idle, fruitless resolutions, but there will be more peace in the world? What evidence is there? I cite from many disciplines: historical, cross-cultural, epidemiological, psychological, etc. Okay, the first person whose writings called my attention to the perspective that I will be developing today is a Swiss, actually she was a Polish Jew who then practiced psychoanalysis in Switzerland, named Alice Miller. And her book, For Your Own Good, Hidden Cruelty and Child Rearing and the Roots of Violence, blew my mind. I had been seeking answers to why did the Holocaust happen since I was a small child, and my uncle came back from the war and brought pictures of the emaciated corpses and survivors of the Nazi extermination camps, and he was in troops that actually liberated some. I had been pondering the roots of violence from the time I was in second grade and my mother remarried, and I had a very abusive sociopathic stepfather who threatened to kill me and caused me all kinds of emotional and physical trauma. But thank God I survived it and also had empathic witnesses who helped me to get through all of that. And that's part of what set me on my quest today. But Alice Miller, when she told the story of Hitler's childhood, I said, oh my God, no wonder Hitler came out the way he did. When she related what she called the poisonous pedagogy and showed the kinds of child-rearing manuals that were in use in Germany at the time that the generation who became the perpetrators of the Holocaust were growing up, it made so much sense to me. And I'd even taught a course at one point, actually in a synagogue, on the literature of the Holocaust, trying to understand how could a group of people decide to murder 6 million Jews and the Roma people and the disabled and so on. How is it possible? A statement from Alice Miller, and again, she was the one that sort of wakened me up in this line of thought. She said, people with any sensitivity cannot be turned into mass murderers overnight. But the men and women who carried out the final solution did not let their feelings stand in their way for the simple reason that they had been raised from infancy not to have any feelings of their own, but to experience their parents' wishes as their own. And what she showed was very normative in that culture at the turn of the 20th century, at the time of World War I, and there are always many causes, not just one. There was such a way of authoritarian parenting that in many practices that we would consider abusive, probably, and that was normative. To go to the positive side of this, however, whoops, something happened there, I don't know what. What about the childhood roots of altruism? Samuel and Paul Allender are sociologists from Humboldt State University in Northern California. Samuel Allender himself was a Hungarian Jew and the only survivor of his family from the Nazi Holocaust. He was hidden under the eaves of a roof, and a Christian peasant woman took him in, trained him to develop a false identity as a Christian, and sent him out to survive the war years. He did survive. 40 years after the Holocaust, Samuel Allender was so perplexed about, why did this woman save my life? Why was it that in Nazi-occupied Europe, 1/2 of 1% of the Christian population took risks for their own lives and the lives of their families to rescue the endangered Jews, the endangered Roman others. 1/2 of 1%, that's only 1 in 200 people took that risk. He went back with his wife, Pearl, who was American-born. They did extensive research using both qualitative and quantitative methods. And what they found that they interviewed 406 rescuers, 126 non-rescuers, and 150 survivors to find out what distinguished the rescuers, the 1 in 200, from the rest of the population. What did they find? Over 60% of the variance was rescuers had been raised non-violently, with close family ties, rare to no physical punishment, and parents who used much reasoning, storytelling, who modeled caring behavior and values, and were respectful in relation to people from diverse backgrounds. They had friends from different ethnic groups, different religions and all. The people they interviewed, by and large, said they didn't even think twice about being rescuers, because that's what decent people do. And they had been raised nonviolently themselves. They were not necessarily the norm of the child rearing, according to the research of Alice Miller and according to the research of Lloyd DeMouse, who I'll mention later. The rescuers showed evidence of being securely attached. Now what does, ooh, I have a laser pointer, hooray. What does securely attached mean? We'll get into that later, I hope, if we have time. That's people with a capacity for what the Islanders called extensive relationships. That is, they had a stronger sense of attachment to others and feeling of responsibility for the welfare of others, including those outside their immediate and familial and communal circles. You know, they contrasted this with what they called a constricted sense of identity and personality, and that came up from people raised in authoritarian families who didn't care much beyond themselves. So one piece of evidence, the childhood roots of empathy, compassion, nonviolence, being raised nonviolently from the start. What's the cultural geography of nonviolence? James DeMayo, a geographer, actually analyzed ethnographical data. You can see from one index there were 50 variables, 1,870 cultures. Another cross-cultural summary, 63 variables, 400 cultures. He found strong association between the more peaceful cultures and nurturing non-violent child rearing. James W. Prescott, neuropsychologist, reviewed data from 49 cultures. In non-violent ones, children were raised in nurturing, physically affectionate, non-violent ways. I can't emphasize that enough. Those were the cultures that had lower rates of social violence, lower war making, and so on. It started with the children, as Gandhi told us, in a very prophetic kind of a statement. What about nonviolence in the absence of physical punishment? In a worldwide sample of 48 societies, the psychologist Barry, again doing very rigorous quantitative analytical methods, found that frequent physical punishment of boys in late childhood is the formative experience most highly correlated with social violence. He found that the absence of physical punishment is especially associated with infrequent violent crimes. Aggression, anxiety, and physical punishment. An international study in China, India, Italy, Kenya, Philippines, and Thailand. Kids subjected to maternal physical punishment showed more aggression and anxiety than peers who were not physically punishment. Cross-cultural, international study, again, high correlation between more aggression in those who are treated with aggression in their families, even though it's inevitably rationalized. We have in the audience here Jordan Ryak, who's one of the nation's and even world's leading activist in support of the abolition of the physical punishment of children. If anyone's interested, he's leaving free for anyone who would like it. His booklet, Plain Talk About Spanking, it's gone through many editions. Jordan has been distributing this for free for years because he just wants to get the word out there. It's a very important issue. Professor Elizabeth Gershoff did a literature review reviewing several hundred published studies spanning about a century, 60 years to a century. What did she find? Substantial evidence that physical punishment makes it more not less likely that children will be defiant, aggressive, delinquent, antisocial in the future, criminal, and more at risk for mental health problems, serious injury, and physical abuse. That's based on a very scholarly literature review, Elizabeth Gershoff. If anybody wants any of these references, my email and my website are at the end. I have an annotated bibliography on my website. I have links to websites like this, and I'll send you any information that you want. You'll be able to get in touch with me. I don't have a hard copy handout. Okay, if we want to create a world that's more peaceful, we don't want to make kids more anxious and aggressive. Quite to the contrary. Now, this is about physical punishment. What about verbal abuse? I have, based on the old saying, words like sticks and stones can hurt. Parental verbal abuse alters the neural pathways in the brain, affecting emotion regulation, language development, psychopathology, anxiety, and depression. Martin Teicher, I think from Harvard University Medical School, and his team of researchers have found now they have neurobiological evidence that both physical punishment and, in separate studies, verbal abuse cause unfavorable changes in the structure and functioning of the human brain, in the very areas of the brain that are involved with empathy, with compassion, with impulse control, with emotion regulation. There is now neurobiological research. I by and large left that out because it would get too technical for this talk. There's a lot of substantiating evidence from the neurobiologists, thanks to all the new neural imaging technologies that we have available to us in the past 20 or so years. Kids of professionals, by the age of 3, there was one study done, here about 500,000 encouragements versus only 80,000 discouragements. Think about this. If you're a kid growing up, and by the age of 3 you've already been encouraged, praised, shown love 500,000 times versus only 80 times been discouraged. Whereas kids on welfare, the parent of welfare parents hear only about 80,000 encouragements and versus 200,000 discouragements. Now, there's something else to know. Our brains are biased for negativity. In evolution, to survive, we have to be alert to threat and danger. So negative words have 3 to 5 times the emotional impact and stay in the memory 3 to 5 times more strongly than positive words. So actually 80,000 positive versus 200,000 negative, the effect is multiplied 3 to 5 times worse than that. If kids grow up hearing, you're stupid, you'll never amount to anything, you're bad, being physically punished, verbally punished, the brains are altered in negative ways that lead to the kind of street violence, gang affiliations, drug use and all, that those of us in my field we're dealing with on a daily basis with some of the kids that we work with. It's not the way to make a peaceful world. Kids need a lot of nurturance and nonviolence from the beginning. What about tyrants? Psychologist June Stevenson, it's actually her pseudonym, her pen name. She did a study of 14 20th century tyrants. She found that they had all, without an exception, suffered repeated childhood humiliations, grown up in violent, authoritarian families, were shame-based and insecure, and had severe personality disorders. Narcissism, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, sociopaths, all the tyrants. And of course, they couldn't have gotten where they were if their pathology did not resonate in some way with enough of a base in the population where they were. If there hadn't been enough authoritarian child-rearing, abusive child-rearing, child molestation, neglect, etc., which history unfortunately has too much of, then they couldn't have gotten away with it. But they were just in the extreme of things that were all too common in their societies. The insatiable craving for power and ruthless violence were rooted in unhealed childhood traumas and humiliations, so they could never get enough revenge on the world for what they had been through. That's the study of tyrants, June Stevenson's work. Back in '97, two women, Carmorse and Wiley, published a study called Ghosts from the Nursery, Tracing the Roots of Violence. Don't worry, I'm going to get to the good side too, about the roots of empathy and compassion, but I want you to see the contrast. They found over 30 factors associated with violent behavior later in life that could be modified or prevented by early intervention with children. Very, very profound. Not only is it maltreatment and deprivations in early life predisposing to violence, and that's often the case, but certain things like prenatal exposure to lead leads to paranoia. And of course, it's the poorest people who have the most exposure to lead early in their lives. Impulsive rage and aggression also associated with prenatal exposure to lead. Increased aggressiveness and impulsivity when alcohol and heroin are introduced to the developing fetus. Nicotine and cocaine increase impulsivity also. So just to show you early, some of the problems that come out in behavioral disorders and all can be started even before a child is born. So Gandhi's idea about the natural innocence of children, we need to reframe it. It's the natural innocence of children if the right prenatal and perinatal and early childhood and later childhood environment are all there, both in terms of physical and emotional and behavioral effects upon the children. Bruce D. Perry, for a child psychiatrist and neuroscientist, talked about what he calls the vortex of violence. Just think of like a whirlpool just going down. He said that, quoting the sociologist Murray Strauss, whose famous study in 1974, where is the major context of violence in America? Hate to tell you, friends, it's not out on the streets. It's in the family. 20% of violent crimes, 27% are family-on-family crimes. 48% involve acquaintances, and the acquaintances are often in the home. If you add up 27 and 48, you get 75% of violence. So we are horrified by the information and the scenes of violence on the streets, and then the wars that get. Where does it start? Bruce Perry talked about the vortex of violence. Those who get brutalized, abused, molested, neglected in the home, then start taking it out, joining gangs, taking it out on others, joining armies, voting for authoritarian political leaders, and so on. Community and predatory violence are rooted in intrafamilial, in the family, violence, and the impacts of abuse and neglect, and the resulting impacts of abuse and neglect on the development of children. 4 out of 5 assaults on children are at the hands of guess who? Their own parents in America. Bessel van der Kolk, renowned neuroscientist and psychiatrist, had that statement in his book. So that's the vortex of violence. We see what happens on the streets more than what's in the home. It's kind of guarded secrets. We need to develop a culture of nonviolence for children right from the beginning, before they're even born. Even maternal loss or often rejection. Adrian Rain at UCLA, he's also a neuroscientist, followed 4,269 males from birth to age 18. Birth complications coupled with early maternal separation or rejection was the leading risk factor for violence by age 18, according to Adrian Rain's study. So I'm just giving you, I don't expect you to remember all this, and I know I'm going very fast because I've got a lot of material to cover, but I really would like to stimulate your curiosity about this, and anybody who wants further dialogue can. But we need to start building peace from childhood up, from before conception and before birth, so that those who become pregnant are going to be healthy and capable of healthy parenting, without physical punishment, without verbal abuse, without neglect. It's so important for peace in this very, very endangered world. What about political attitudes, liberals, conservatives, and so on? Childhood roots, according to Milburn and Conrad, two sociologists, two social psychologists at University of Massachusetts, Boston. Punitive political attitudes, such as favoring war as an instrument of national policy and capital punishment, result from punitive upbringings. It's the people who are raised with punishment, for whom punishment, war, aggression makes sense in a political way. This is especially so for males who have not benefited from psychotherapy. Psychotherapy makes a difference. Males who had those punitive upbringings, who benefited from psychotherapy, who let down their defenses, who opened up to their feelings of vulnerability, to their shame and so on, developed less punitive political attitudes. They weren't so in favor of war and capital punishment. Childhood anger, according to Milburn and Conrad, and they cite many, many studies, is displaced onto political issues and outsiders. See, it's easy to pick on outsiders. What Alice Miller pointed out in her pioneering book was that when we're little kids, we depend for our survival on our parents. So we can't criticize them if they're abusive. We can't criticize the culture that supports them. We depend on it for survival. So then outsiders, outgroups become targets of our aggression. And you can name many, many, many sorts of outsiders who become targets of aggression on this. Punitive political attitudes, xenophobia result from childhood abuse and neglect. Adverse childhood experience studies done in Kaiser. I'm sorry. I did this on Keynote, which is a Macintosh program, but we didn't have the right connector for my Mac computer. It looked fine on my computer, but I have it on a memory stick and some of it got scrambled. Kaiser Permanente did a brilliant epidemiological study. It's called the ACE study. ACE is the acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences, negative childhood experiences, yeah? 17,338 adult patients. They had extensive medical records on them. They looked for 9 adverse childhood experiences, including recurrent physical and emotional abuse, contact sexual abuse, alcohol and drug abuser in the home, incarcerated household member, someone chronically depressed, mentally ill, institutionalized, suicidal, and 1 or no parents, and then emotional and physical neglect. What they found in graded fashion, the more adverse childhood experiences, the greater the risk for dysfunction in the affective, somatic, substance use, sexual, and aggression-related domains. So much human misery. Some statistics are up here. You can see having 4 or more ACEs, for example, in terms of, where is it? Ever attempting suicide, 1,220% more probability of attempting suicide. I didn't find their injecting illegal drugs, 1,030% more risk. When kids have accumulations of adverse childhood experiences, such as many of the clients that I and my colleagues who are here work with in the nonprofit clinic we work in Richmond, you get all kinds of physical breakdown, immunological disorders, and behavioral problems. This is one of the most robust epidemiological studies ever done. One epidemiologist said his whole career he could never expect to see such robust results again. It's very serious. Now, you might think, well, you know, I'm putting up here what's called epigenetics and the role of human behavior. Anybody here not know what epigenetics is? You know, we used to be taught, we used to be taught that, like, well, you just have a bad gene, you're born that way. You know, these kids are just born bad, they're born violent. Other kids are born, you know, the other way. But it's been found that the environmental factors, especially those in the primary relationships of our life, affect how genes are expressed. Whether or not genes are turned on or turned off or kept off. So neither nature nor nurture alone determines whether humans are violent or nonviolent. Rather, our experiences, particularly in our formative relationships, you know, the people, the primary caregiver in our childhood family, our moms, our dads, our siblings, and so on, early in life determine how our genes, particularly those controlling our stress response, are expressed. You know, fight or flight. You get people who are always ready for a fight. It doesn't mean they were born with bad genes. It means they had adverse childhood experiences that have led them to that way. Child abuse leaves epigenetic marks on DNA itself. And there's so much evidence supporting this now. Take the example of a neuroscientist named James Fallon. He had been studying the brains of sociopaths, and he found that their brain scans showed in the orbitofrontal cortex that links, the limbic brain with the neocortex. Very important for executive functioning, very important for moral reasoning, ethical behavior, self-awareness and self-regulation. He found deficiencies in the orbital medial prefrontal cortex, OMPFC. Guess what? He did a scan of his own brain. He found the same deficiencies as found in sociopaths who are cold, predatory killers. In fact, he also had in the MAOA, the monoamine oxidase A gene pattern, the same pattern as sociopaths. It's a variant on normal that gene. That gene regulates serotonin uptake and functioning. And deficiencies in serotonin are the most significant neurotransmitter marker found in those of individuals with violent aggressive tendencies. He had both OMPFC deficiencies and MAOA gene pattern of sociopath, but he is nonviolent and pro-social due to early nurturance, despite being descended from a family in which some of his ancestors had been violent sociopaths. He had a loving mom. His wife met him when they were 14. She gave testimony to this. He found he had the same pattern. So early nurturance and loving kindness trumped genetic deficiencies. This is profoundly optimistic news for the human species. We are not born to be violent. There's a lot of neurobiological evidence for that. James Fallon's brain is an example, and he was willing to publicize that rather than try to hide this disturbing failing because he had a lot of self-confidence. We'll have plenty of time for question and answer afterward. I'm zipping through here, friends. All right, another psychiatrist, James Gilligan, spent 25 years as the lead psychiatrist in the with the convicted serial killers, rapists, and so on in the prisons of Massachusetts. He wrote 2 books. One is called Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, and another, Preventing Violence. He posits the universal cause of violent behavior. And again, we want to get back to nonviolent behavior, to empathy, compassion, and so on. But I want to contrast it with this. He posited the universal cause as the violent person is overwhelmed by feelings of shame and humiliation, as well as being insulted, disrespected, ridiculed, or rejected by others, or treated as inferior or important. That its violence is always a desperate and risky attempt to gain respect, attention, and recognition for oneself or one's group, and to displace the shame onto others. They see the shame in their victims, but they can't get rid of it in themselves. Egregious child abuse. He was able to document it in over 90% of the backgrounds of the most violent offenders with whom he had worked. Highly respected psychiatrist. The perpetrators even see themselves as agents of justice, in quotes. That is, they're avenging themselves for past injuries. It's horrific, but it's the way it is. They put themselves, he had it coming to him the way he looked at me. So the guy blasts them out, or, out of existence. It's just terrible. Violence is made, not born, is what I'm saying. So therefore, non-violence, compassion, empathy are also made. We are interpersonal beings. We co-create humanity together. And the formative relationships with children are the primary place that this begins. It doesn't end there, but it begins there. Gilligan himself, whom I just cited, he observed that most people are not violent. And even violent people are not violent most of the time. Lonnie Athens, a sociologist, criminologist, he spent 20 years interviewing violent offenders also. He found 4 stages of becoming violent. Brutalization, where they themselves are victimized, or they witness closed others being victimized, like their mothers being beaten repeatedly, or their siblings and so on. And violent coaching. Somebody was there to say, yeah, that's the way. The world is divided between either you do unto others or they're going to do unto you, so you better be one of the avengers. I've worked with some kids like that. Damn it, they're not going to be the victims. They'd rather be the perpetrators. They don't realize there are alternatives to that. He said after the brutalization, then comes belligerency, where they feel harm or be harmed. Then they do some violent acts, and then it's virulent. They're caught in that. But it takes a lot to change a human being into a violent perpetrator. It's not born. Even for soldiers, the US Army had a problem. In World War II, they found that only 15 to 20% of US soldiers were willing to even fire at an exposed enemy soldier. It didn't come naturally. They started changing their training methods. By the Korean War, they had 55% of soldiers willing to fire at exposed enemy soldiers. And by the Vietnam War, it was up to 95%. Drastically different training methods. They added up. I don't want to go into it now, but just it wasn't easy to turn American recruits and draftees in the Army into killers. They had to work hard at it, and they used, unfortunately, in my opinion, psychology, and they're still doing it to this day. In fact, a very famous psychologist at University of Pennsylvania, the leader of the so-called positive psychology movement, got a huge contract from the US military to train soldiers in what they call positive psychology, to reframe in their thinking, using cognitive psychology methods to reframe what they're doing, so that they'll have less inhibitions for doing it, and also less, PTSD results. But guess what? The symptoms of perpetration-induced trauma, in soldiers in particular, have been found to be even more severe than the symptoms of PSD in victims. Killing other people takes a toll for most human beings, except for the sociopaths who don't have any form of attachment or connection to other human beings, who are cold and predatory and remorseless. But most people, if they kill someone, their PTSD symptoms are even worse. Guess what? 1 in 6 US servicemen currently are on at least one psychiatric drug. It's serious. Lloyd DeMause, psychohistorian, has tried to interpret history and politics in relation to the evolution of child rearing. He's largely ignored, but he sees wars and social violence, ignored in academia, unfortunately. I think it's a major model and deserves more attention. He sees wars and social violence as the restaging of early traumas, the kind we've been talking about here. What about the effects of socioeconomic deprivation on kids? I barely touched on it. Salabitz and Perig. Children growing up in groups of societies under threat will be more likely to be raised with harsh or distant caregiving. Poverty is not good. War is not good. Unemployment is not good for parents to have the emotional and material resources to raise their kids in the ideal nonviolent ways. So the direct violence on kids and their families is also connected with the socioeconomic, the structural violence, the inequalities. I don't think I have time to go into the case of the ick that the anthropologist Colin Turnbull had studied, but it was the people in Uganda who were forcibly displaced from the environment where they knew how to survive. He witnessed in one generation parents selling their kids into prostitution, neglecting to raise them, kids stealing from their own family members, killing and so on. In one generation, when they lost the socioeconomic base that they knew how to live in. It was for a hydroelectric project, they displaced the whole tribe. Very serious. There are kids under threat worldwide. Child laborers, 246 million. Slaves, 6 million. And on and on. You can see the dismal statistics. Kids lacking adequate shelter, 640 million. Lacking access to safe water, 400 million. This is not good for emotional health, let alone for physical health. It's not good for parents to have the resources and the presence of mind and the patience. It takes so much to raise a child. It's one of the most difficult, challenging responsibilities on earth, and also the most sacred. It takes so much, and I see some heads nodding of parents who know, because they've been there, they are there. It takes so much. Poverty and the horrible inequalities of wealth and power we have in this world and access to resources are not good for making a peaceful world. They're like prescriptions for war and violence. Okay, take a breather for a second. There's more. That was the first half, and we got it done in 45 minutes. I'm glad you're still laughing and not too many people have run for the hills.
Wow. Is this a good part now?
Yeah, now I want to introduce for many of you attachment theory and research, which sheds a lot of light on empathy and nonviolence. The emphasis is going to be on the positive, and there's a lot of supreme, beautiful research done at the Adult Attachment Laboratory at UC Davis, very close to here, by Philip Shaver and Associates, also in collaboration with Mario McCullenser at Bar Ilan University in Israel. They have a website with dozens and dozens of their papers published. It's good news for those of us who want to see a more peaceful and a less violent, a more nonviolent, compassionate, caring world. It's really good news. But it's buried in scientific papers that not too many people have the appetite to read. Attachment theory and research. What is attachment? Now, those of you who are involved in spiritual traditions are learning to detach from the world, possibly. Please, the definition here is different. It's a different frame of reference. Same English word, different frame of meaning. According to John Bowlby, who was the really pioneering British psychiatrist in this field, also an anthropologist, attachment is an innate, it's born in us, evolutionarily based behavior system that motivates us to seek proximity, nearness, to one or a few wiser, stronger people, attachment figures, often mom, not necessarily mom, who will provide a safe haven for comfort and safety and meeting of basic needs, as well as a secure base from which to explore the wider world on a sustained basis. This is born in us. Evolutionarily, it's there. We have whole circuits, major circuits of our brains devoted to attachment. What is secure attachment? Well, Bowlby said, and there's just an image that tries to say something to you. All of us, from cradle to grave, are happiest when life is organized as a series of excursions, long or short, from the secure base provided by our attachment figures. The people who give us safety, who give us comfort, who give us nurturance, who give us encouragement, love, who can, rub us when we have a boo-boo and, we fell down and skinned our knee or whatever. Attachment, self-esteem, and worldview, and another set of research that I can't go into now, are seen as a tripartite security system. It's major, major work, but no time for it now. Neurobiology, extensive neural networks in the human brain are dedicated to attachment. The brain is primarily a social organ. This huge human brain that we have. In evolution, it's primarily a social organ. There's tons of research about it. And it develops optimally with secure attachment. When attachment needs have been met well in early development, the complementary caregiving behavioral system can function optimally. So if you want parents to be good parents to their kids, to be good caregivers, teachers, therapists, friends, they need their attachment needs met. Otherwise, there's a deficiency and it gets messed up. And I'm going to show you exactly what's involved in that. When attachment needs are not fulfilled, the consequences to the individual and society cause a wide range of dysfunctions from moderate to severe. There extensive worldwide research has found 4 basic attachment styles, beginning in early childhood, persisting in later life, resulting from the relationship with the primary caregiver or caregivers. Influences on attachment styles include the caregiver's own childhood experiences. Very, very, very important. Even if not explicitly remembered, it's in the body, it's in the emotional reaction, it's in the stress response system. Also family history, trauma, culture, socioeconomic conditions, politics, and on. So attachment style is not subject to conscious control because it's more deeply rooted in the brain. But if we go for therapy, if we have a spiritual meditation practice and so on, we can actually do something to work toward more secure attachment if we didn't start off there. That's good news that I'll have a little later on. There are unequal attachment experiences. Are you still with me? I know it's a lot of stuff in a short time, and I'm talking like a locomotive. The quality of, we still have over an hour left, so we're getting there, I promise. Then we'll have, I can hear it from you. I can hear it from you. The quality of care we receive from our early attachment figures affects, for good or ill, all levels of our development, including the growth, structure, and functioning of our brains, the baselines of neurotransmitters and hormones, our capacity for self-regulation, our health, emotional awareness, cognitive development, the internal working models of self and others, and more. Early care influences the expression of the genes controlling our stress response, something I mentioned earlier. An overview of the attachment styles, 4 basic ones, we can hold on to it. There are 3 organized attachment styles. Secure, maybe 45 to 55% of the population are actually securely attached. Guess what? They tend to be the people that find a partner and they stay together lifelong. It kind of works for them. And those of us who didn't start off that way, we wonder, how the hell did they do it? I'm laughing at myself, friends. Okay. So it's very organized, and you'll learn about it in a moment. Then there's the avoidant insecure attachment style, and you're going to learn about all these. Maybe 20-25% of the population, the anxiously insecure attachment style. All 3 of these are organized. And then there's the disorganized insecure attachment style, maybe 15%. This is where we find the criminals, the severely psychiatrically disturbed, a lot of behavioral problems, and so on. Okay, secure attachment, brief look at it. So, by the way, I don't know, because I have to fit only a certain number of characters on the side, I sometimes use the word carer rather than caregiver or caretaker, because I saw it in some British and Australian publications, so the carer, just because it had fewer characters to it. What's the picture of secure attachment? Well, for the primary caregiver, she's free and autonomous. I'll say she for now because it's often the mom at the beginning, not necessarily, but often. Available, sensitive, attuned, perceptive of the child's feelings and needs, responsive, effective, caring, fun, helpful, encouraging. She amplifies the happy feelings and soothes the stress. She or he. Not 100% of the time. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's an attachment, a caregiving machine. We all goof up. But enough so that the kid is easy to soothe, confident, expects to be helped, has a positive sense of self and others, internalizes the caregiver, as a source of comfort and refers internally to her or him to feel safe while seeking stimulation elsewhere. Remember, we go on wider and wider excursions into the bigger world from where we start, and we can always come back. That's the secure base, a safe haven and secure base. Second pattern, organized, avoidant, insecure attachment. The key there is the caregiver is kind of dismissive, unavailable emotionally, distant, rejecting, unexpressive, doesn't recognize or empathize with the child's feelings, has a discomfort with closeness and interdependence, has extreme self-reliance, like I don't need anybody else, positive sense of self, negative sense of others. That's usually the dismissive kind of adult. And it goes into adult, like romantic relationships, friendships, and so on. What happens to the child? Child shuts down, turns inward, doesn't expect to be soothed, under-expresses feelings, because if feelings don't get a response, why express them? Doesn't seek proximity to the mother in the strange situation where they take 1-year-old kids and mothers into a strange situation. The mother leaves, there's strangers there. What does the kid do? That's some of the basic research on it. Okay, so that's the avoidant insecure attachment. About 25%, 20-25% of the population have that. You'll see more about that in a moment. What about the anxious insecure attachment? Also organized. The caregiver is ambivalent, inconsistently available, sometimes responsive, sometimes unavailable, sometimes overly involved and enmeshed and intrusive. What happens to the kid? The child, and then who grows up to be an adult, fears I'm unlovable, fears rejection from others, gets angry at the threat of separation, is insistent on the need for love and approval, gets preoccupied with attachment needs, endless, hopeless romantic, emotionally expressive or even overly expressive. Here I am, negative sense of self, but a positive sense of others. Don't worry, there's still hope. Disorganized attachment, the last category. See, we're almost through all 4 and I'm getting hot now. The carer, actually, the one who should be by evolution the source of safety and security, frightens the child. It's usually due to unresolved trauma and or grief. The caregiver actually traumatizes, abuses, and neglects the child, may herself or himself be depressed, has personality disorders often, mental illness, addicted, aggressive, sexualized. All of that goes to leading to disorganized attachment in the child raised in that kind of household. The child, it's disorganized, you can't quite predict it. The child behaves chaotically, injures themselves or others, dissociates, just, not there anymore, freezes, emotionally speaking, that's a technical term, has contradictory behaviors, like approaches someone like this, rather than like that, excuse me. So that's a contradictory behavior. The mother leaves in the strange situation, comes back, the child may approach like that, and then all of a sudden lies on the floor and starts screaming and beating himself on the head. It's pathetic. It's dysregulated on all levels, so borderline personality disorder, etc., etc., etc. There's a high correlation with personality disorders, severe psychiatric disorders, aggression, violence, and criminality with this attachment style. That's the overview. We're going to get to the good news, I promise you, we're getting there. Empathy and secure attachment. Now, we've given you the overview of the 4 attachment styles. Here's some of the work. Shaver, Gillis, McCullen-Sernall, UC Davis, and Bar-Ilan University in Israel are the main sites of this really profound and important research that almost nobody knows in the wider world except people who are geeks and read this kind of stuff. Being secure with respect to attachment, either by disposition from having received consistent empathic care in childhood, or even momentarily due to experimental intervention. They actually give temporary secure attachment to people by various clever social psychology experiments. It's associated with empathy. That's one of our themes, folks. Empathy, helping to keep everyone awake. Compassion and responsive altruistic behaviors. These are self-transcendent values. Tolerance and attachment security. Securely attached people show greater tolerance for out-group members. Remember the Allender study of the rescuers of Jews. They rescued members of out-groups. They were securely attached. These guys have a lot of experimental research data to support this. In the world we're living in, intolerance of out-group members is so often associated with the massive group violence and warfare that exist. This is such important stuff, guys. This is in the adults, not just the little kids. Greater tolerance for out-group members when you're securely attached from the get-go, from the beginning of life. Sense of self-worth. Securely attached people show lower physiological reactivity to ego-threatening stimuli. So someone could come up to a securely attached person and, start cursing them out and demeaning them and for whatever. If they're securely attached, they're not going to start getting into a fight about it. Because they see there's something wrong with that person. They've got no place to land in them because they learned a sense of self-worth from the beginning of their lives. This is very relevant to a less violent, a more non-violent, compassionate, empathic world. Have a more stable sense of self-worth, are less reactive to feedback about acceptance and rejection. They don't get violent if someone doesn't like them, if someone criticizes their talk or slideshow or something. They don't have anything to worry about. And they're less biased by self-promoting needs. Empathic responsiveness and secure attachment. Securely attached people are more sensitive and responsive to others' emotional self-disclosures and need for support. And they express more affection and support, for example, before temporary separation, thereby enhancing relational security for themselves and others. Open-mindedness and secure attachment. Again, think of how much violence there is in the world because of a lack of open-mindedness for different religions, different political ideologies, different backgrounds, cultures and all. Securely attached people have more coherent, complex, and flexible knowledge structures. Okay, someone's a Muslim, someone's a Christian, someone's an atheist. They can handle that. They're more flexible. They're not rigid in their thinking. I wish I could say we, but I can't assume anything here. And have more positive mental representations of self and others. I'm glad some of my humor is getting through. If I'm keeping your attention this long, I gotta inject someone. Okay, now here's the good news for those of us who did not start off life with secure attachment. Okay, here I am. I'll confess. Secure attachment, if not derived from early care, can be earned through later sustained relationships, one or more, with emotionally healthy, empathic others. Maybe a therapist, a teacher, a mentor, a friend, a life partner, a lover. Even healthy kids can sometimes bring that for people. So this is called earned secure attachment. We have to learn it. Those of us who spend years and years in psychotherapy, we're just trying to learn how does it feel to be less neurotic, which is a lot less work than the alternative. But other good news, that since I'm a yoga teacher and I have some fellow yogis and yoga teacher in the back of the room here, mindfulness practices, such as done in yoga and meditation, have similar psychological and neurological correlates as secure attachment and can provide similar benefits. So like the Niroga Institute that some of us are affiliated with here is bringing yoga, mindful yoga practices out to underprivileged kids, for example, in the juvenile halls and in at-risk, high violence zone schools and all. It actually helps develop physiologically some of the changes in the neurotransmitters, the hormones, the brains, the self-awareness, and then therefore the awareness of others. So there are ways through healthy relationships and through mindfulness practices where people who start off life less secure can become more secure. This is very new research. The paper I cite there is from 2007. It's not well known yet. It needs to be well known. This stuff, yoga can make a difference, for example. Okay, so we've just shown a lot of good news about secure attachment and empathy and nonviolence. What about what's called the avoidant insecure attachment style, that comes from having a parent who's kind of dismissive and unresponsive and cold? Avoidant insecure people ward off their own feelings and needs, and they tend to be dismissive of the feelings of others. They lack empathy. They tend to be cynical. They can make all kinds of degrading little jokes to put down other people's feelings, and not very responsive when people show their vulnerability and need. So I have a question here. I haven't seen the research on it. Does this attachment style correlate with politically conservative denial, psychological defense mechanism? Because Milburn and Conrad, in their brilliant work called The Politics of Denial, identified conservative denial as denial of the evidence of the suffering of others and denial of their own vulnerability. Political, arch conservatives all have actually greater fear of death and more nightmares than liberals, according to the research on the subject, just by the way. But don't worry, liberals have their own issues. Their own denial patterns. What about anxious, insecure attachment and empathy? People with anxious, insecure attachment may become overwhelmed through identification with and overreacting to others' feelings, thereby impeding empathy, which is based on understanding both how another feels and how oneself feels. Remember that qualification about objectivity. In other words, someone can so over-identify with the suffering of others, they can't be very helpful because they got to protect themselves from being overwhelmed. Question, I don't know any evidence. Does this correlate with liberal politics, which includes a liberal denial of one's own aggressiveness? Anyone here ever been in a peace group with incredibly aggressive people? I've been there. Or even a spiritual ashram with aggressive people? And also denial of the capacity of others to act out destructively. Something to be aware of with the liberal orientation. There really are people who've gotten to the point where they will commit very evil acts, where they will steal national elections for the presidency, where they will wage war, where they will give the billionaires on Wall Street all the financial rewards for their misdoings while the rest of us have more unemployment, and so on. They do act evilly. I'm not saying they are evil intrinsically, but they act evilly because it's violence, structural violence at least. Okay. What about disorganized attachment, the fourth category? We're almost at the end of the slideshow. Breathe a sigh of relief. We're almost there. Then you can go on the attack. Okay. Traumatic abuse in childbearing leads to the hot, impulsive violence, sometimes associated with the borderline personality disorder. The person is so insulted and they go into a rage, they kill someone in a barroom fight or whatever, and then they can regret it actually afterwards. This is according to a major literature review by Alan Shore, a major neurobiological theorist in Southern California.
Really?
So that, the kind of hot but later remorseful, impulsive violence is related with severe abuse in child rearing. Where do the sociopaths come from? Severe early neglect predisposes to the cold, predatory, remorseless violence associated with antisocial personality disorder, sociopathy, etc. The same thing. This is based on a major literature review that Alan Shore did. 2 patterns of violence. By the way, Roger Walsh of the Pfeiffer Institutes of Health did research with violent incarcerated prisoners, in the death rows or, in the lifetime sentences in the prisons. He found 2 distinctive biochemical patterns in the killers that were there. No one's tried to do this that I'm aware of, but I suspect the different biochemical patterns from the sociopaths to the impulsive, violent people would correlate with what Roger Walsh found. It's very interesting. Again, not as well known as it deserves to be. He was actually able to use food supplements and change of diet and all to reduce the violent, aggressive acting out in the prison. But when they got outside and returned to their normal lifestyle and their familiar habitat and their old associates and their old crappy diet, they got violent again. Okay, just a few slides now, friends. Helpful interventions. Based on what I've shown you already, we could go on for years of seminars. But I just selected a few from among many that are needed. 1, the nurse intervention program. Anybody here ever heard of it? Where they take families in at-risk communities where there's a lot of poverty. There's been a lot of history of abuse and neglect of kids and gang and so on. And they have a trained nurse who visits the mother weekly during her pregnancy and for the first few months after birth. 15 years later, they kept following up the study. They showed a 59% decrease in arrest rates for the teens whose mothers had been visited by the nurses.
Wow.
That's in France, right? That started in France.
Yeah, but it's been here too. And a 50% decrease in substantiated reports of child abuse and neglect. And as we've seen, child abuse and neglect lead to all kinds of horrific personal and societal problems. It's a good program. Another program, Roots of Empathy program, Mary Gordon, actually she spoke at for $130, I think this Friday, sponsored by a local organization, Center for the Science of the Greater Good, I think, sponsored her.
Science Center?
Yeah, the Greater Good Science Center. They've developed a curriculum for grades 1 through 8. It involves 27 classroom visits during the school year, 9 with the mother and baby there, showing where the beginning of empathy right is, and all these thousands and thousands of interactions that a primary caregiver and a baby will have. Then they have follow-up lessons. The children are actually exposed through these first 8 years of school to what nurturing caregiving looks like, and they've had very good, I think, outcomes from this program. Mary Gordon's a Canadian woman, I think from the East Coast of Canada. Okay, World Health Organization put forward a violence prevention program. They call it Violence Prevention, the Evidence. Guess what number 1 is on their list? To develop safe, stable, nurturing relationships with children and their caregivers. This is all available online on the World Health Organization site, and they show what a safe, stable, nurturing environment for children and their caregivers is. They're talking about secure attachment, friends. That's number 1 on their list. Number 2, developing life skills for children and adolescents. Something like the Monroe Institute has a transformative life skills program for kids in juvenile hall and everything, where they're learning self-regulation of their overreactive physiologies and so on. Number 3, reducing the availability and harmful use of alcohol. Alcohol is the drug most associated with violence. Probably most people here knew that. Whether it's drunk driving violence or actually, murders under the influence and so on. Reducing access to guns, knives, and pesticides. Okay, and this is worldwide, the World Health Organization. The guns, in Richmond, I've been working here 3 years. Actually, December 14th is my third anniversary of being on the job in Richmond. I've heard about more murders for people I'm working with, whether in their families, whether perpetrators that they knew, whether they've witnessed murder on the streets when they're, they're coming home from school or something, more in those 3 years than an entire rest of my life. That's the population some of us who are here are dealing with. I'll be 68 years old this month. I've never in my life been so close to enrichment. I have kids I have one client who had a gun at the age of 11. He finally sold it. I work with another girl whose boyfriend was an ex-gang member she drove him to a place where he wanted to sell his gun, getting out of the gang life. He was murdered right in front of her eyes. Yeah. So this makes so much sense to me because some of us here are really up close to that. Reducing access to guns, at least, reduce these terribly, overly effective means of aggression. Promoting gender equality to prevent violence against women, that's a whole other subject I haven't touched on much tonight. It's very significant World WHO program. Changing cultural and social norms that support violence, that's in the level of what Johan Galtung, a leading peace researcher, calls cultural violence. We have direct violence, structural violence, and cultural violence. All the movies, the video games, the myths, the songs that are all celebrating and supporting that violence is normal. It's not. And by the way, while I'm on that subject, it's in one of my pockets if I can find it. The American Friends Service Committee has a nice little graphic. See the red thing there? This is the national budget for 2011 of the United States of America. The red thing there is 59% of all the expenditures of the federal government for the military. Nuclear weapons, war, etc.
And that is more than all the other militaries in the entire world combined and then some.
Right. So we are in terms of cultural violence, I see these gang member kids, some of whom I work with, they're kind of replicating on their little turf scale what's going on in the world, friends. Here, what do we have? 6% is the next biggest, and that's on health and human welfare, etc. It's a very telling graphic. We live in a culture of extreme violence with lots of violent media and so on. And here I'm starting off how we raise the children. Well, I think exposure to violent media is another thing that needs to be taken into account. They also recommend the WHO a victim care, identification, care, and support program. So it's huge. You can get, the URL is there. I mean, I know you can't take it down this fast, but I've got it on my website. I've got it to send to you if you want it. So big picture thinking, and then we're done. We need to eliminate egregious socioeconomic equality. In other words, we need to end structural violence, and we need to work actively for it. And I know it's horribly difficult, and I don't have the answers on how. But those who are peace and justice activists in so many different fields are actually working to create conditions where the world can be safer for children. We just finished the United Nations Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence for the Children of the World. It didn't happen. You saw how many millions of child slaves, prostitutes, child soldiers, over 300,000 child soldiers in the world, and so on. We don't have a culture of peace and nonviolence for the children of the world. How can we build a culture of empathy, nonviolence, and peace for the adults? And we need to preserve the planet for future generations. We have to end ecocide. Friends, we're in serious ecological trouble. That's not news to anyone here, and I'm not saying to scare us, but I want us to be galvanized. There's no future for future generations. I liked, I think it was the Haudenosaunee people of the northeastern part of the United States, the Iroquois Confederacy, they're known in English. They had a principle that when we make policy decisions, we have to consider the impact on 7 generations from now. We're not even doing it for 1 generation from now in terms of the cutbacks on all the social welfare programs, the services to children, the art and music in the schools, the physical education, cut back. But we've got 59% spent on maintaining the American empire of dominance over the rest of the world. Something's got to change if we want kids to grow up with the capacity for the human brain and character is very malleable. I believe that our primary potential is nonviolent, but I believe our secondary potential is violent. I close with a quote from Lao Tzu. It's obviously not his picture. This is an artist, Nip troubles in the bud, sow the great in the small. Difficult things of the world can only be tackled when they are easy. Big things of the world can only be achieved by attending to their small beginnings. We all had small beginnings as little, a sperm and egg, and then growing through the stages as little infants, as little toddlers, as little children. I've tried to show in rapid fire fashion some of the evidence in support of Gandhi's statement that if we would only begin to build peace starting with the children of the world, then we would, that Y should have been there. It was on my original slide. That's my website, that's my email. If anyone has questions, suggestions, compliments. We actually have 45 minutes for discussion. I hope that now it's your turn and that whatever has touched you, moved you, puzzled you, intrigued you, made you angry, whatever, let me know. Ruth?
Yes, I wanted to raise the gender issue because
Yes.
I think it's not separate at all.
I agree.
You had mentioned that the highest correlation with social violence is the physical punishment of boys. Now, forgetting the unequal treatment of women, when we have a culture that says big boys don't cry,
Yeah.
and that big boys who do cry are weak like girls,
Yes.
and that the only way you can really express yourself and feel good is by being strong and maybe hitting someone, okay, you've got the basis for trouble. And I'm aware, but I can't cite it, of research that even at the youngest age, some mothers will hold the boys a little differently.
Yes.
They don't want to be quite as nurturing.
Yes.
So I think, and now the other side of that is being sensitive, intuitive, and so on, has been traditionally in this culture made feminine and devalued.
Yes.
And I would just add to that, the highly creative person, who's also more mindful, more aware, and sees alternatives, is less stereotyped in either of these categories.
Yeah.
Is more able to be assertive and sensitive.
Thank you for bringing it up. The research evidence is very clear. By the way, most of the physical abuse of boys is done by mothers, not by fathers. That doesn't mean there isn't physical abuse of boys by fathers also, or sexual abuse. Mothers are with the kids much more than what. Mothers look in the eyes of their boy babies less than they look in the eyes of their girl babies. Mothers hit their boy babies more often than they hit their girl babies. Teachers continue that. In 20 states in this country, children are still hit in the schools with paddles. Jordan is a leading crusader against that practice, nationwide and worldwide. Boys are socialized to inhibit their feelings. Mothers tend to respond with more empathy to their girls. Now, Bruce Perry, in the concept of vortex of violence, says you have an abusive husband who's just been, humiliated by his boss. He comes home, he yells at his wife, he smacks her, he beats her around and all. She takes it out on the kids, the older siblings take it out on the younger siblings, the kids take it out on the streets. That's what he calls the vortex of violence. So, boys need more nurturance, more empathy, more care, more reinforcement for being able to show their vulnerable side. However, we come out of histories of some warrior cultures. We know that the Spartans actually dropped the baby boys, on the ground, and those that died weren't hardy enough to become warriors. We have a history of warrior cultures that partially socialized their kids so that they could be warriors. There's a lot of unconscious habits that have to change. The gender issue is a major one. Lloyd DeMouse, the founder of Social History, has a good essay called Why Boys Are More Violent. It's going to be coming out in his forthcoming book. He cites a lot of this kind of research, from the primary sources that I'm just touching on here, and you made all the good points. Yeah, the stereotypes of males and females in the media, it's pathetic. It needs to change. Yeah. I consider myself I was primarily socialized by women, by the way, and the peace activist legacy comes down through 3 generations of female line on my Jewish family, where my great-grandmother had fled from Latvia. My great-grandparents on my maternal line all the way had fled from Latvia to get away from the pogroms, the massacres of Jews, to London. Her oldest son was sent into World War I and murdered on the battlefields. I mean, killed in Hamad there. She never got over. I knew my great-grandmother when she was in her late 80s and 90s. She couldn't be reminded of war. She fed all the stray cats in her neighborhood. She had a whole basement full of stray cats that could come in and out. She was so sensitive to any suffering. She had lost her son. She was permanently, you know, PTSD from that loss. My mother's only brother, Ray, was then sent to the battlefields of World War II. And so in my early childhood, I was born in '42, the year when more Jews were killed than in any other year of the Holocaust. I was surrounded by the fear that my grandparents, especially my grandmother, had, that their only son would be killed in the Europe that they had fled from to come here, to get away from the wars, to get away from the pogroms of World War I. He got badly wounded in the Battle of the Bulge. He survived. He came back with pictures of the death camps that then shocked me as a little kid. And then my mother wrote an essay when she was in high school about causes of war and so on. So I'm sort of, you know, I'm a male, but I'm a male who can cry and can carry, you know, who's vulnerable. Whether or not the women in my life have liked that or not. But yes?
I just want to mention I have a website called Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. And it's the URL is cultureofempathy.com, and it has the largest compilation of material on the internet about empathy. So there's all kinds of videos. I'm working on a documentary on the topic of empathy, and just interviewed Mary Gordon, who does this program, did an hour-long interview, and Michael Lerner, and just a lot of people in the area. And so there's all kinds of material there to kind of follow up, and I think it's really great that you're talking about this, especially the scientific part, because it's kind of giving the effort to build a culture of empathy a scientific foundation, and kind of showing that we're not born to be greedy, selfish, you know, self-interested, but there's an empathic quality in all of us that can be nurtured. And it's also about organizing. There's a Facebook site there with about 600 members, and it's like, how can we get together and start actually organizing around the value of empathy to build a culture of empathy, you know, within yourself, between yourself and others, and society at large.
Yeah, and we're natural allies. I never met this gentleman before, and he just sent me an email and said, can I videotape your talk and put it on the internet? I said, great, you know, maybe more people can see it. Great. So we'll talk more about that. I think Kumar, who's the founder of Ahimsa, had a hand raised.
First of all, I would like to commend you for a very thorough coverage of the subject.
Thank you.
In a short time. And also the delivery was very rigorous. My question is about one of the slides you presented, that if in childhood there is a lack of secure attachment, then that can be compensated or made up later on in life by mindfulness and yoga practices. I tend to believe, I'm rather sort of pessimistic, whether secure attachments can be developed in childhood in a culture which was born with a lot of violence, in a nation or a culture. And also even the current factors, sociological and the political, etc., and the life, when there is no time, you have plenty of things, material things, but you have a lack of time. So I think for mothers and fathers to try to find time for secure attachment is very short.
Yes.
But I'm interested to find out what is the explanation that mindfulness, when you have grown up in this kind of culture, that mindfulness and yoga practices can make up for that.
Because they go down to the level of physiological self-regulation, which is below the level of the conscious thinking brain, and start creating rhythmical breathing patterns, rhythmical heartbeat, start shifting from sympathetic nervous system overdrive to fight, flight, or freeze to a more parasympathetic and vagal relaxation responses and so on. The kinds of things that under the optimal conditions a loving parent will be able to provide for the child. We don't come into the world with our nervous systems and our breath and our digestion and our heart rates and our brain waves regulated. We need care to regulate. So the yoga practice from thousands of years and so on has developed ways to cultivate self-regulation that some people are fortunate. They just got it from the beginning because they don't have to think about it. Like the 1/2% of rescuers of the European population who rescued Jews in the Holocaust, they didn't have to think about it. It came naturally to them that you care for others. They were regulated and securely attached people. So I think there's a physiological and neurobiological reason for this, that it gets down right to the brain stem, the diencephalon, the limbic brain, and then it works from the bottom up. But in addition to the yoga and the mindfulness practices, the healing relationships are very important. That's what some of us do as therapists. We're trying to provide an emotionally healthy, sustained relationship over time. And hoping that on an unconscious level, the brain patterns, the neurological networks start developing a new sense of self and a new sense of others. Gee, I'm really capable of love. I'm working with a girl who was sexually molested by her grandfather at the age of 8. She doesn't believe she's lovable. She doesn't believe she can ever learn in school. She's such a good kid. But her cognitive development shut down after that. So her reading scores are at first and second grade level. But I don't think she's, quote, retarded. I think she's seriously traumatized and didn't have the kinds of relationships that can help her. And a lot of teachers don't even know about that. A lot of school psychologists don't, but we have at least one good school psychologist here who does know about it. Henry.
So just want to point out that from a physiological, neurological, psychological point of view, we've got cookies and soft drinks to kind of allow us all to resonate with one another from a internal, deeper sense of fullness.
Thank you.
Let's all grab something to drink and take.
So, are you breaking up this Q&A session now, Henry?
Well, we have about 15 minutes.
I'm really honored that you came. I want to thank the entire Ahimsa Board of Directors for giving me this luxury of basically 2 whole hours. I'm used to going to like conferences where you get a 10-minute slot on a panel or something. This has really given me a chance to try to hopefully inspire some people to think along some lines, not to remember every word I said, maybe not to remember any words I said, but to really get it, how important this is. And I think this video has been promised to be put up on the internet.
In about a week on my website, cultureofempathy.com, you can share it with your friends.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.